Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging out here. I know our day is winding down. Appreciate you being here with me. So we're going to talk a little bit about PKI and really what's been going on in the PKI space. So I'll do a quick intro, a little laying of the land, set the stage of the story that we're going to tell, and then just talk into what's going on. Some of the vulnerabilities that have come out, some of the tools that have been out there, and then probably the most interesting thing for all of you is that whether you're on offense or defense, where do you go from here? How can these things help you in whichever one of those sides you fall on? And then I'll aim to leave some time at the end for any questions. So briefly about myself, I'm actually now a senior CSA, Cloud Solutions Architect, previously called Premier Field Engineers, previously called Customer Engineers. My title has changed 3 times in the last 18 months, but it's still the same job. I've been doing that at Microsoft for 7 years, been in cyber one way or another for about 25 years. And basically what my role is I'm out working with our customers. I work with customers of all sizes in every industry vertical. On the reactive side, I work with our DART teams doing incident response and threat hunting, helping customers respond and recover from incidents. And on the proactive side, everything from design and architecture to assessments to teaching workshops. I spend a lot of time on PKI. Over the course of my career, there's been times where I've spent up to 75% of my time in any given year on PKI. Right now, it's about 25%. Worldwide, there's about 4,500 people in my role at Microsoft, and there are 12 of us that focus on PKI. So PKI is a scarce skill even for us. I estimate that in the years that I've been doing with it, I've probably had my hands in about 600 different PKIs. It's a lot. And unfortunately, I keep seeing the same problems, the same mistakes, the same misconfigurations. So we're going to talk about some of those. Quick disclaimer, I do work for Microsoft, but they are not sending me here. They are not sponsoring this. All the information is my own. Everything I have to tell you, all of my bad jokes, all of the sarcasm, and there'll be plenty of that, that's all from me. So we want to talk about PKI, and PKI is both broad and deep. So in order for us to talk about what's going on, we don't really have time to get into all the details if we were focusing in on one particular vulnerability. So I'm going to abstract a lot of that away as we go and just try to fill in some of the pieces. But setting the stage a little bit, PKI isn't new. As we know it today, PKI has been around since the 1980s. ADCS, Active Directory Certificate Services. So that's the Microsoft implementation of the standard of PKI. And that's been around as we know it today since Server 2000, really where Active Directory got its start, Active Directory Certificate Services did as well. So why all the attention? What's going on and what can you do about it? That's what we're going to talk about for the next half an hour or so. So these are what I feel are the most important things that have come out really in the last couple years. So we start with some of the history where eventually that PKI standard was published, ADCS came out, a couple other things along the way. And then what you see here in the timeline is what I'm going to run us through today. On the top are attack techniques or papers that have been published or some novel idea that someone came up with. On the bottom of this timeline, you're going to see a listing of tools. A lot of times those tools got paired with some finding or some announcement. Sometimes not. Sometimes it was in addition to a tool that was already out. But this is basically the timeline. So the idea here is PKI in the pandemic. So a lot of this really starts from around when that pandemic was really in full swing. Not that there's necessarily any correlation to that. That's just the time box that we have. So we jump right into a little bit of the precursor here. Really, relatively before the pandemic, there's this thing called PKINIT. What this is this was designed to do Kerberos pre-auth with certificates. And at the time this got developed, that was a really big deal. And that was way back in 2006. And everyone just, they used it, they didn't use it. There really wasn't a lot of work put into it on the offensive side until around 2020. At that point, Ethical Chaos, that's the Twitter handle, I don't actually know the person's name, they put out this really interesting research and they figured out a really good way to abuse this property. The idea is that if you get a user's private key, you can basically use that to do all sorts of badness, even leading to a full domain compromise in some cases. So this person published some research about it. They put some work into a tool, and they also added their support into another tool that already existed. So a lot of interesting things got done here. So the idea is that if you're in an environment, maybe you can't necessarily compromise the domain as a whole or anything really high value, but you're able to compromise a user. And normally, at least on a Windows system, every user has full control and full access of all of their own certificates. So it just makes sense that if I compromise a user, I could get a hold of their certificates. So then if I'm able to do that through this attack, that lets me arbitrarily generate TGTs, leads me to a TGS, and now I can do all sorts of cool stuff. Now, what I can do varies quite a bit, and a lot of that is into the research, but this was not something that really was known up until this point. If it was, certainly there would have been a lot more research before it. So it was a really interesting approach. A couple things that are really exciting with this, and I noted on the bottom, is this can even work with a smart card, a physical or virtual smart card, any kind of hardware token even, where an actual certificate is involved, meaning a private and public key pair. So this gentleman that released the tool and released the research, they put out this little code snippet that can actually intercept the PIN via an API hook. So if you are using even a physical smart card, this attack can still work. Obviously, there's some scaffolding and things in place, but it was a really big deal at the time. And up until this point, there wasn't a lot of groundbreaking, we have a clear attack chain going on with PKI. It was always kind of known that, yeah, if I compromise the CA or a domain admin who can then get to the CA, or a CA admin, if hopefully they're separated, bad things are going to happen. But this was really the start of a lot of very specific and scaled attacks where we saw an attack chain not start with all of that crazy privilege, but still end up with it at the end. From there, we get to what I think is probably the most important thing in this timeline. So back in June 21, Will and Lee put out this really groundbreaking white paper. And this was a big deal for a lot of reasons. In all the time I spend working with PKI, customers expect that it's going to work like a lot of other applications and services, meaning there's a cookie cutter way to do it. And there's absolutely not. If I look at 10 different PKIs, I expect to see a pretty significant difference in its configuration and its design and its architecture. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Most people that deploy a PKI, even in very large enterprises, they read a guide online and they follow it step by step, and they have that exact PKI. And yeah, it works, meaning certificates get issued and they get to be validated, but there's a lot of problems there. A lot of the reason behind that is PKI is kind of a catch-22. You can't do it really well without experience, but how do you get that experience if you can't do it? So we have all of the documentation that you might need publicly. The last time I looked, it was somewhere around 12,000 pages. That's a lot. When I work with a customer, I would always tell them that starting from nothing, if you want a PKI, plan for 6 months. And 90% of that is design and architecture work. You work on a whiteboard, you're talking to different teams, because we can script out the deployment very, very easily. But customers don't spend that time. So they look for something quick. And along the way, they don't understand all of the configuration. They just take guesses at things, and weird things happen. So this paper changed a lot of that. This paper, somewhat concise in that it was a little over 150 pages. I personally don't think there's anything really new or earth-shattering in it. But what it did do, really for the first time ever, is within the confines of this paper, you got a really good end-to-end description of how PKI works, the different elements, design elements, how certificate works. And then it laid out a series of potential attacks and vulnerabilities, not only where the problem is and how you might look for it, but also how you would exploit it. So I went from having customers that really couldn't come up with a good question about PKI to customers that would say, hey, on page 72 of this white paper, it says this, and how does that work with our PKI? So all of a sudden, I could see that this was having a lot of effect. So this was a really big point as far as PKI goes. And I'm seeing that today still. The implications of this paper getting out there are just starting to get rolling. And I think a lot of the other research that was done and the other vulnerabilities and tools that I'll talk about is directly related to how much this opened the eyes of the industry. So if you're into PKI or if you're responsible for it in some manner, if you weren't aware of this paper, if you didn't read it, I highly recommend that you do. It's really amazing. So what was in the paper? Outside of explaining how things work, it really focused on what bad things can be exploited with PKI and how do you do that? And it gave this really a series of numbering and tracking for all of these issues. So the biggest group were these escalation ones, and they're abbreviated as ESC, and there's 8 of them that this paper defined. The first 4 were really all about taking advantage of misconfigured templates. Not a vulnerability, nothing with code, nothing really special, just simply that you're relying on the fact that the administrator didn't really know what they were doing, or they didn't do due diligence when they set up the PKI. And that's phenomenally effective. A lot of those will directly lead to a domain compromise. Number 5, look for vulnerable PKI objects itself. And by that, I mean PKI objects in Active Directory. Because again, if I could affect those objects, I own part of the PKI, which once again leads to domain compromise. Hopefully you're seeing the theme here. So think that next to your domain controllers, your CAs are your next most important thing. If I compromise a CA, I own everything, just as if I compromise a domain controller. And we've been shouting at people for a long time to monitor your DCs and separate administration and do all these other things. And people are doing that really well now. But PKI is just still a mystery for a lot of people, and it's not happening. Go down the list here. Number 6, SAN flag. So what SAN is, subject alternative name, is you think of it as like an alias. So I issue a certificate to my email address, but I could put a SAN in there that basically lets that same certificate have an alias for something else. So what's the danger? Well, danger is, as a normal user, I get a certificate for myself, but I put an alias in the certificate as maybe your CFO, and now I can do all sorts of bad things. So that particular issue was all around abusing certificates that allow a SAN to be put into it. Again, not a vulnerability, but a misconfiguration that's being taken advantage of. We get down to number 7. We're talking about the CA itself being misconfigured. So the CA application itself has an ACL just like anything else, and you have to define administrators and who has all these different rights. Out of the box, there's 4 different roles that are already there, and you can extend that to more. And unfortunately, again, people do that poorly. When we get to number 8, number 8 is really the only true attack here, and it's an NTLM relay. And I'm going to talk more about that in the next couple slides because a lot more work happened there. In addition to those, there are some other headings in this paper that talk about ways to steal private keys. So those had the theft tag, and then there's a number index after that. And ways that gave you persistence in the domain, but maybe not necessarily escalation. There's another group of those as well. So again, for the first time ever, there was this really good, concise kind of operating manual for people that are mostly attacking certificate services, but for defense as well. All right, so we go forward another month into July of 2021, so not that long ago, and we have PetitPotam. So disclosed by Lionel, this is really the direct attack against that ESC8 issue that the paper called at. So when that paper was published, they said, here's an issue, and theoretically, here's how you would do it. And we can stitch maybe all these tools together, and maybe sometimes it's going to work and sometimes it's not. But when this came out, we had a very clear method, we had specific tooling, and it really became a script kiddie operation to exploit this issue. So what we do is we find a CA that is vulnerable to it and an ancillary role with the CA where the HTTP endpoint was available. So when I say ancillary role, within Active Directory certificate services, there's actually 6 different roles. Certificate authority is only one of them. All of the other roles, like OCSP or NDES, they all sit on top of IIS, all sit on top of web services. So this attack works with a combination of the CA being vulnerable and that HTTP endpoint becoming available. So then you simply perform a relay attack in a specific way, and if it works, well, it couldn't be worse. DC sync is a very obvious and probably the most common thing out of this, but you can imagine that anything less than that, any subset can also be done. It's full systemic compromise. After that, now we take a pretty big jump forward. We're into kind of the current year now. Certified. I love the names. So Oliver Lyack. This was interesting that this took some time. He disclosed this in December, just this past December, but we didn't patch it until May. So it was responsibly disclosed and no one really knew about it until it really came out. These are really considered number 9 and number 10 in that list of escalation methods. And this was really interesting. So what happened here is that it turns out that in certain cases, systems and Active Directory and CAs and all these other things that come together to make this work wouldn't account for a $ at the end of a machine name. And in other cases, there were ways to make conflicts and spoofs between some of the properties that exist in Active Directory and fields within a certificate. Really phenomenal research. So what that meant is, if you were able to do this, once again, you were able to basically leverage a full control of the environment. So you would request a cert from a template. It had to be a machine template because of the fields that were available and what you were able to have permission to. So in some cases, if you already had a lot of permission, like domain admin, you might be able to leverage other certificate types, but at that point, well, you have domain admin and it doesn't really matter. So this was a really novel approach where you're coming from really no particular privilege. You just have the ability to request some certificates. So the worst case scenario here comes true. If this fires off, you own everything. A DC sync attack or just about anything else you want to do. So why did it take so much time for a patch to come out? Well, because we were patching it. It does take that time to do that. So KB, and then I'm not going to read that whole number. That number is our patch code. So when it got publicly announced, we had already made that patch available. And this was pretty interesting. So you need to patch the domain controllers, all of them, and you need to patch your CAs, all of them. Once you do that, a new extension will be made in the certificate. So an extension is just a property. There are dozens to hundreds of them in every certificate. Some must be there. Some can be added at the whim of the CA administrator to serve various purposes. This only works for enterprise CAs where there's templates involved. So that means that if you have a CA that is not an enterprise CA, and that doesn't mean it's not Windows-based, that just means it's not domain joined or it's not using templates, this doesn't apply. And if there's no templates anyway, this doesn't apply. The reason for that is this fix works by the CA and Active Directory working together. A new field gets added when the certificate gets issued, which creates what the patch refers to as a strong binding. Basically, what happens is when the cert gets issued, we use the SID of the user or the device and a few other things depending on what's configured to derive some unique value. Because again, the issue was that things could be spoofed and duplicated and replayed and all these bad things that we don't want to happen. So this creates uniqueness. Depending on the configuration that you have, and the KB explains all this, there are 6 different types of binding that can be created. 3 are considered strong, 3 are considered weak. But that's what this patch did. Now, what was important though is that you had to patch everything. because if I didn't patch one of my domain controllers, well, my attack could just target that domain controller, and I could get my cert and perform the attack. By the same token, I had to patch all my CAs, because if not, an attacker could figure out which one isn't patched. So this took some work. This was really rough. And then kind of a grab bag there. Concept of golden certificates. We've had silver and golden things forever. Tickets, tokens, certificates, whatever. Idea with golden certificate, pretty straightforward. I get a certificate that really lets me do anything. Probably it's going to start by compromising the CA. But when we say compromise the CA, we don't necessarily mean that we're interactively logged into it. We just mean that we can assume the identity of the CA. That means the private key. We get a hold of the private key of the CA from a backup or some other method. In effect, we become the CA. And now we can do anything we want. And this attack is just an example of that. So in the span of 20, 25 years, there was not a tremendous amount of PKI or ADCS in the limelight for attackers. There were always things that people could do. Good pen testing firms and red teamers would know their way to do stuff, but you had to bring a whole lot of stuff together. It didn't always work. It created some noise, probably not that anyone was listening, but it was still a thing. And now all of a sudden, in the last 18 to 24 months, there's been a tremendous amount of new things, new research being published. There's been a couple new things just in the last weeks and months, and there's more on the horizon. So now is a good time to think about PKI if you're responsible for it, or if you think you can leverage it in attacks if you're on that side of the world, because I think this snowball is just going to keep rolling. Now that people see what's going on, it's going to get bigger and bigger. So along with all of these novel techniques and white papers, we've got a bunch of tools. So I'm calling out what I think are probably the most valuable ones. I think with these 4 tools, you can deal with all of the vulnerabilities, attack path, exploits, everything that I've talked about, everything in these white papers are all covered by these 4 tools. And probably you might even be able to get away with just a couple of them, depending on what you're trying to do. So the one on the top, Certify, that was actually published by the people who made that white paper. So it is a specific tool designed to look for the existence of those escalation vulnerabilities and to abuse them and do them actually in the environments. It's a pretty slick tool, really lightweight. I mentioned Rubius. Rubius is kind of the outsider here. This was related to the PKINIT. So lets you do curb interaction and more. And again, it's been out since decades or more. But now that we can do certificate stuff with it, now it's important again. Pass the cert. It's another tool related to that. It has a little bit more ability, like being able to work with smart cards and hook the APIs and things like that. And then Certify. Certify is pretty much everything all in one. And if you can tell by the name, it's Python based. So there's a lot of new things that came out around this time. So that's the bad news. The bad news is that a lot of research is going into PKI. People are understanding it more, which is good, but that also means adversaries are understanding it more, and so are script kiddies and basically everyone else under the umbrella. There's more and more free tools that you can download and just do stuff with. So now what? Think about the PKI, think about monitoring and assessments. These are the 3 takeaways I really have. And we're going to talk about each of these. These are especially important if you're a defender or if you're at all responsible for some type of internal IT. You don't have to be the PKI person or even the security person, but you can make awareness of this in your organization. On the other hand, if you are on the offensive side, you can think that these things are starting to happen more and more. I definitely see that. The amount of requests that we get from our customers related to PKI continues to go up. Once there is a nice, shiny new PKI in an environment, people come out of the woodwork with use cases for it. So this is going to be important more and more. So the first thing is, before you even think about the PKI that you have, do you have an old one? Every time I go to a customer where we're working with PKI, I straight up ask them, tell me what you have, how many CAs and all of that. And then I look into the right container in Active Directory, and usually I find 3 to 5 times the number of objects that they accounted for. Because people randomly had permissions, they spun up CAs, they just pulled the plug on them, and you can't do that. There's actually a cleanup process once objects get to AD, and that hardly ever happens. If that's happened, those objects can still be abused in the right circumstances, even if the servers don't exist. If nothing else, though, it's a good sign that you don't have really good care and feeding of the environment. So you want to be aware of what's there and do some cleanup. You want to just have an awareness overall if you have a PKI. It should not have to be guesswork how many systems that you have and what their connections are. And if that means a 100-page document for you, fine. If that means a half a page of bullet points, fine. If that means a Visio diagram, fine. Have something. PKI is absolutely a tier 0 asset, meaning if an attacker compromises it, game over. Full systemic identity compromise, just as if they compromised a domain controller. So everything that you're doing to protect your domain controllers, you should be doing with PKI. Think about if PKI is a critical infrastructure for you. For most of the time, it probably is, but until you really think about it, most people are going to say no. So what are you issuing certs to? And if all of a sudden those certs didn't work, would your whole enterprise come down? I mean, are you using certs with your VPN, with your email, for RDP connection, for code signing? So all of those things can probably tolerate some amount of downtime, but not a whole lot. So you really have to make sure that's thought about. Absolutely think about things like your DR plan, your business continuity plan. That needs to be part of it. All aspects of infrastructure really needs to have some awareness to PKI because it's going to be involved. A lot of that is going to start on the security side with monitoring and alerting. And I'll be the first to say that we don't make this easy. Most people, I'd say 75% of the time, have little to none of this turned on. And those that do, it just goes into a bucket somewhere. So not only does the PKI team not necessarily know what's going on, but the SOC doesn't have alerts, doesn't have signaling, and even if they did, they don't really know what to do about it. So these are the places you want to get events from. So the first one is you want events from the CA itself. And these are both operational and security events. So I want to know, did the service fail to start? Did I issue a CRL or not? But I also want to know, did a config change? Did permissions of a CA admin change? The tricky part here is you have to turn this auditing on in 2 places. And if you don't do it in both, you will get very, very few events. So the first one is obvious. You have to turn it on the OS side. There is a way to do it in the GUI. I'd prefer the command line. That works there too with the certutil command. But that only gets you so far. You also have to turn it on at the operating system level. So you have to go into advanced audit policies, and there's an object access for these events. If you don't turn that on too, you're not going to get all the events. Now, this is a really good example of why we like to see PKI objects in their own protected sub-OU in Active Directory. Because we're going to push a really aggressive monitoring and alerting and logging profile to all of these systems. And you're just not going to be able to do that to every server in your environment. So without even talking about the security reasons to do that, just the fact that we can build all this in one GPO and push it out to the whole PKI makes life easy. And maybe if you only have 2 or 3 CAs, that's not a big deal. But if you have a lot more, it's really going to be a time saver. It's going to make your life easier. After that, we want to know about the objects in AD. Hopefully, your Active Directory team can help you with that. Hopefully, they're doing some kind of monitoring. But that's something that you bring to your security team too. So there's a group called cert publishers. And When you build an enterprise CA, it adds its own computer object to that group. There should never, ever be anything else in that group. Certainly no named users. Very, very rarely an enrollment agent or a service account. But it's usually the Wild West, and no one has any idea what that group does. That group should be monitored. So if someone gets dropped into a domain admin group in your environment, does someone get an email or a phone call? I hope so. That cert publishers group should be the same. And if you've defined your own CA admin group, same thing. They should be monitored. So there's this whole block around Active Directory you want to look at. Templates are huge. You want all of the events around templates. You want events when a configuration element changes, when templates get loaded or unloaded from a CA, because this is really going to be the sign of things going wrong, either from an attacker or an administrator that just doesn't really know what they're doing or testing in production or something. These events are not on by default. So you have to turn this on, and when you do, you'll get 3 new event IDs that are all around templates. They can be a little chatty. The assumption with all of this is it's going to a SIM somewhere and hopefully even a SOAR, but you want these events. There's no way to see this otherwise. And if nothing else, this gives you a good tracking of what happened. So you go and look at a CA and you're troubleshooting something and you find a setting on a template and you know, well, I didn't set it like that. What happened? Well, if I've got the logs, now I can figure it out. I know who did it and when, and I can go and find them and slap their wrist a little bit. But if I don't have events, it's just guesswork. So you want these events. You also want to monitor the registry. On every CA, all of the configuration is stored in the registry. And when certificate services start, it reads that config and goes to work, which means you can make as many changes as you want on a CA, but until services restart, none of that is going to take effect. That also means that if you're monitoring the CA really well, I'll just go and directly edit the registry and make my changes, and you're not going to see it. So once again, CAs have specific ways that you can monitor the registry. And again, all of this would get dropped in a GPO, ideally. The ancillary services are the oddball out. So NDES, OCSP, CEP says web enrollment, but I hope no one's using web enrollment anymore. All of those sit on top of IIS, and they all have different things to monitor. NDES is heavily based in registry values. OCSP is heavily based in IIS config. So it all differs a little bit. But you need to figure that out, and you want it to monitor all the things. So we're thinking for the PKI team, operationally, what's going on? I need to trace things back. I need a trail of what's happening. But from the security side, I want to be able to respond to these things too, because PKI, once it's up and running, year over year, you're probably not making really big changes. So it should be really easy to see what's going on. There's not a lot of noise there. And then all of this was really with that security focus. You want to think about the operational side. If something goes down, if something doesn't publish, if something isn't connecting right, that's important to know. There should never be a case where part of your PKI goes down and you're just like, okay, we'll get to it. You probably have hours to days to fix it before certs actually start failing. So whatever team is responsible for the PKI needs to get that information in a timely manner. So how do we get better? Well, most of the issues with all of these white papers and published techniques, 90% of them are based on a misconfiguration. So a lot of that is people don't know PKI. So you've got to fix that. HSMs, hardware security modules. In the most critical attacks with these methods, it's because someone is able to get a hold of the private key of the CA. Once that happens, you're done. So how do you fix that? Hardware security module is a physical device designed to hold the private key of the CA. And not just hold it, but it gets made in the HSM, and it never ever leaves. So unless someone can physically get into your data center and take it, and some of them are very small, size of a mobile device or a pack of cigarettes, or they can be the size of a washing machine taking up 24 rack units in your data center, depending on what your needs are. They can be network connected, they can be directly connected with a USB style cable. But these devices are made to secure that private key. And that can go a long way to stopping the worst case in a lot of these scenarios. I mentioned it before, and I'll mention it again. treat CAs to the same level of security as a domain controller. That means tier model, or hopefully the newer enterprise access model. The tier model isn't really a thing anymore. Control lateral movement, control privilege escalation, secure administrative practices, go through a PAW, don't deploy user applications on a CA, do all the right things. The bottom two there, training. I cannot stress this enough. Training is important. We make workshops, a few other vendors do. There's not a whole lot out there. So it's pretty easy to find, unless you want to read the 12,000 pages of documentation and lab it out on your own for a while. And you'll learn a lot. That's something to do too. But you want some training. Not only for the PKI team, but for people that are related to it. So your SOC or your threat hunters, incident responders, they should have an intermediate level of knowledge of PKI. I bet they have it for domain controllers and Active Directory, so it makes sense they should have it for PKI too. Consider an assessment. Again, there are firms that do it. We do it as well. Sometimes it's just really hard to see the forest for the trees, especially if you're not really an expert in PKI or you don't have time to be one. You just need someone to say, here's a document of all the things you're doing wrong. And that shouldn't just be, here's the document, where's my check, I'm out the door. It should be, here's the document, let's sit down for 2 or 3 days and talk about all of those issues. Let's talk about why it's a problem, how you can get better. Was it something you didn't know? Was it something you guessed at and got it wrong? Did you do it that way because that's how we do business? That's fine. Let's talk about that. Let's figure out if there's another mitigation that we can do. But you need to do those things. If anything else, any takeaway that I can leave you with is if you have a PKI, get a good assessment done and get some training for the people responsible for it. More than anything else, that's what's important. All right, so I know that's been kind of a whirlwind run through about what's going on, what to look for, and that's really what I wanted to touch on here. So definitely want to say thanks for the conference, for having me. Thank you all for being here. I'm on Twitter. You're welcome to ping me. My DMs are usually open. I'll be around for the rest of the day if anyone wants to chat. We have about 10 minutes, I think, for questions if anyone has them. And thank you very much. Did you have a question? All right. Yes. So the question is, do I have thoughts about on-prem versus cloud? I have a lot of thoughts about that. So it's really interesting. 4 or 5 years ago, people that had PKIs, they wouldn't even make a CA as a virtual machine. They didn't trust it. Most of the federal government still has physical servers for their PKI. And most people that interact with FedRAMP and stuff still do that. So talking about the cloud for them is like crazy. You want us to put it somewhere out there? And so for a root CA or a policy CA, if I suggested that, I would probably be laughed out of the room for most people, and I would never suggest it because I think it's just as crazy. For issuing CAs, the time is coming. I don't know that I would feel comfortable doing it yet. The technology is there. You could just, drop it, infrastructure as a service, you drop the VM in anyone's cloud, it'll work, but how do you secure it? Vendors have HSMs in the cloud too. We do, others do, but still, there's that element of, do we trust it? We're starting to see people make a PKI as a service, for lack of a better. So you could get certificates, but you don't really own or manage the PKI, and people are trying to figure out how much they trust that right now. So the short answer is, I don't think it's there yet because we don't have answers to the security questions. The technology is fine. It would work well. You would get rid of a lot of overhead, a lot of native ways to do monitoring and patching and all these other good things. But the thing with a PKI is it's there to give you trust. And if you lose any of that trust, there's no way to get it back other than building a whole new PKI. So people are very cautious about that. To spend months and years designing a PKI, and one that's probably going to last a decade or two, you don't want to do something dumb And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, okay, I have no assurance in this. I can't trust it. We got to start this again. So, yeah, so unfortunately, no real answer other than, it's going to get figured out because every customer I see asks me about that. Any other questions? Good question. So the question is, if you don't have an HSM, is there still a threat vector with a root? So the idea with a root is a root should be always offline, meaning it should be probably a physical box, maybe a laptop, because it only probably needs to come online maybe once a year. It's going to spend 99% of its time powered off. Should be, in a Pelican case, sent to Iron Mountain or locked in a safe or something like that. So if it's truly offline like that, there's no attack vector other than an insider threat. So in those cases, that's something that a security team has to think about. We would still always recommend an HSM. But, the threat vector is minimal, I'd say. I think it's still important. And likely, if you're investing in HSMs for the rest of your environment, there's no reason not to use it there too. Even if you're using network HSMs for everything else, most of them, you could find a model that has one direct connection on it purely for the root to use. Most vendors offer that too. But if you were really against it for some reason, it's better not having it on the root than not having it on another CA. There's always a threat. Any other questions? I think we still have 5 minutes. All right. Oh, another question? For it. Wildcard certs. Okay. Question is, anything to think about with wildcard certs? So wildcards are interesting. I think we love to hate them. So operationally, they're great. So the idea is that if I go to a website and I go to www.microsoft.com, I need to be presented with a certificate that says that or an acceptable wildcard. So if it says ftp.microsoft.com or if it says bankofamerica.com, I'm going to get a warning and that's not going to work. But most of certificate usage happens programmatically. So you're not going to get a warning. It's just going to fail because it's designed to do that. So operationally, when I can use wildcards, I have less overhead. I don't have to issue certs to all these individual boxes. And there is a time and place for that. But they are certainly very, very dangerous because if an attacker gets a hold of one, now they can use it practically anywhere within scope of that particular set of systems, not just that one user or that one machine or that one website. So there is danger, but there are some things that truly do need a wildcard. The same is true for the SANs that I was mentioned, so the aliases on a certificate. They're very dangerous, but they serve a purpose, and there are some things that legitimately need it in order to function. So it's definitely a risk acceptance kind of discussion, which can be hard because sometimes the person that needs to figure that out doesn't understand the threats, doesn't understand PKI, or no one does. So to get that figured out on paper is tough. The best thing that I would say is, strive to not do it unless there's a real specific reason. Things that are more dangerous like that, I don't want them living a long time. So I don't want a wildcard cert to be out there for 3 years. I'd like it to be 6 months. So that can help. So the idea is that if it is compromised, I know I'm going to roll the key a little bit sooner. So, you got to weigh that risk. But no specific do it like this. As a general rule, that doesn't exist anywhere in PKI, which is why people have so much trouble with it. I think one more question. We have time? Yes. So the question is there published guidance for DC and business continuity and things with PKI? And not that I'm aware of, because every PKI is going to be a little different. So what you have is going to be different. So do you have a hot standby data center, or are you fully in the cloud? It's going to make a difference. Is your PKI 5 servers or is it 200? That's going to make a difference. What applications need to work from that PKI? So unfortunately, there's nothing that I'm aware of, but it's probably not that difficult to put something like that together. Far, far easier than the design work needed to build the PKI itself. Unfortunately, that's the best that I can say. I think we're out of time here, so if anyone else has questions, feel free to hunt me down, ping me on Twitter. Thanks again for being here. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and have a great day.